So a quick chapter one review. Just remember that there was lots of history at the beginning of the chapter. Obviously, we're going to focus our time on the perspectives or approaches, but don't forget to just kind of glance over the people at the beginning. So Socrates, Plato, and Descartes, kind of being our first people who believed in nature over nurture influencing us. Then Aristotle and Locke. Probably the most important thing from Locke is to know that he thought the mind was a blank slate and that experiences really matter. So again, Aristotle and Locke are nurture over nature. That was also known as tabula rasa, the blank slate. So then how did psychology develop as a science? Remember in class we looked at it in terms of waves of psychology. So if that's helpful for you to learn it that way, then just glance again at your PowerPoint. But remember, psychology's roots are in medicine and philosophy. So that's what a lot of the people were doing as they started to explore this field. Wilhelm Wundt is credited with as being the founder of psychology. This is when psychology actually began with his experiment in the first psychology laboratory in 1879. Remember, he was testing lag time. And his student was Edward Titchener, and he was the founder of the school called Structuralism, and he used the method of introspection, which was looking within, in order to explore the structural elements of the mind. After that came functionalism, which focused on how our behavioral and mental processes function and how they enabled us to adapt and survive. The founder of that is William James. He wrote the first textbook, Principles of Psychology, which was over 1,000 pages and in 2 volumes. Gestalt psychology then came after that. Remember, we didn't spend a whole lot of time on Gestalt, but the school of psychology that studies how we perceive and experience our objects as whole patterns. So remember, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if I asked you, why do you love your parent? You could give all of the individual reasons, but that wouldn't essentially add up to your love for your parent, according to Gestalt psychology. So neither of those 3 stuck around very long. And we're going to get into kind of the more contemporary views in a second. Remember that psychology has 3 big issues that they look at: nature versus nurture, which is a big one. That's one that you definitely want to look at, and it's discussed more deeply in chapter 3C, which we didn't spend a ton of time on, so I would make sure that you maybe glance at some of the nature-nurture issues in there. Stability versus change. So do our traits change as we age, or do they remain stable? And that's a big developmental issue. And then rationality versus irrationality. So are we in control? Do we have free will? All of those things. Biopsychosocial approach. That is probably our most contemporary view. And those are the 3 different levels of analysis, which really allows us to get a good picture of what's going on with somebody or with a situation or a behavior or an issue. So remember that typically today we use an eclectic approach. We don't just look at it from a biological standpoint or a sociocultural standpoint. So just keep in mind this chart down here, what we would lump under the biological influences, the psychological, and the sociocultural. So when you're examining any issue, like an eating disorder, for example, or something like that, the biopsychosocial approach would say we really need to look at all 3 of the areas that are adding to the development of that eating disorder. All right, so where we're going to spend most of our time would be on psychology's perspectives or approaches. So remember, each of the individual ways that you might try to look at and explore a problem. So instead of that eclectic approach, we would be looking at it from one specific viewpoint. Remember in class, you got a small article on the power of first. So we looked at first experiences related to love, related to loss, success, all of those things, and you had to try to look at it from 3 different perspectives and explain it. So hopefully that takes you back to the first week of class. So what we know when we're looking at the biological approach, for example, remember that they're going to study basically the brain and body system. So anything related to your body chemistry, like hormones or blood chemistry, brain parts, any of those things would be considered in the biological point of view. Evolutionary, that's obviously going to be natural selection. It's going to look at Charles Darwin, obviously survival of the fittest. So essentially how our genes are allowing us to adjust in order to survive. Behavior genetics is one that is a little bit newer and isn't probably, I wouldn't think that it would be on the test at least this year or maybe next year, but I would still know it. And behavior genetics is essentially nature and nurture together. So how our genes and our environment are going to influence our individual difference. They just give it the name of behavior genetics. Psychodynamic approach, remember that that's going to look at how our behavior springs from our unconscious drives and conflicts. So now that we learned about Freud, that's really focusing on anything Freud related. So our keywords here are going to be unconscious, childhood conflict, anxiety, things like that are going to tip you off that it's coming from the psychodynamic approach. Behavioral then, remember, is everything external. So it's not about how you process things necessarily. It's focusing more on your observable responses. So when we model behaviors that we see or we imitate those behaviors, that would be behavioral. When we're reinforced or punished or any of those things that you learned with Mr. Ray, that would be the behavioral approach. Cognitive approach then is the exact opposite, even though you guys tend to confuse these two very often. The cognitive approach is only focusing on our internal cognitive processing. So how we're thinking about things, encoding, storing, retrieving, memories, all of those things are going to be under the cognitive approach. Humanistic approach then is focusing on the fact that we all have free will, and remember, we're all born as like good people. It's just whether or not our needs are being met, whatever those needs might be. So the triangle of Maslow, or the empathy and all of that stuff of Rogers. So it's how our needs are being met, and if they're being met, then we're going to reach our full potential. But again, we have the free will to choose. It's not determined at an earlier time. And then sociocultural is looking at obviously like our environment. It might be our family. It might be being raised in Wisconsin or Verona versus Madison or whatever it might be. So how our behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. I also included the chart from your book on here. If you want to freeze it quick and kind of take a look at that, you're welcome to do that as well. So just a couple examples here. Somebody working from a biological perspective might study the brain circuits that cause you to get like red in the face when you get angry or frustrated, or how heredity and experience influence our individual differences in our temperament. The evolutionary perspective might analyze how anger facilitated the survival of our ancestors' genes. Somebody from a psychodynamic perspective might view an angry outburst as an outlet for unconscious hostility. Somebody working from the behavioral perspective might attempt to determine which external stimuli trigger angry responses or aggressive acts. Somebody from a cognitive perspective might study how our interpretation of a situation affects our anger and how our anger affects our thinking. Somebody from a humanistic perspective, which is really more important historically, it's not even necessarily a contemporary approach anymore in most textbooks, might have been interested in understanding how angry feelings affect your potential for growth and personal fulfillment. And somebody from a social cognitive perspective might explore how expressions of anger vary across different cultural contexts. So those are just some specific examples. And then don't forget to look at your Appendix A. All you have to do really is glance through it. But remember that there are subfields of psychology as well, which are really more like career fields, even though they're going to mirror the approaches that we just talked about when you talk about biological or cognitive or things like that. But it definitely goes much further. Now that you've been through all the units of psychology, it's going to be easier to narrow down what developmental is or social is or personality is. But there are a few in here that I would definitely take time to look at, like industrial organizational, human factors is in Appendix A, and clinical, which you know based on disorders and things like that. And then just a couple key terms. So the difference between basic research and applied research, which is right there in front of you. And then remember that we spent time differentiating psychiatry from psychology. Psychiatry is a branch of medicine, which deals with psychological disorders mainly. But remember, psychology is not a branch of medicine. It's a whole different degree. So the medical angle is going to be psychiatry. They can prescribe drugs and medicines and things like that. So that's pretty much it for Chapter 1. Again, this is only 2 to 4% of your test. So once you kind of get through it, look over some of the main ideas. Like I said, your real focus is going to be understanding the different approaches, maybe glancing at the people, and then I would definitely glance at Appendix A just to be familiar with it.